Thank you, Michael. So I'm Stuart Wolpert, Director of UCLA Conversations. On behalf of the Emeriti Association and the Retirees Association, welcome. We have a really, really good program for you. We have two really talented students here. They're both in the Herb Alpert School of Music. They're both seniors, both graduating this June. They both won awards and honors. Delighted to have them. And they are students of two terrific professors, Inna Faliks and David Kaplan. Terry has studied with Professor Kaplan, and Grace has studied with Professor Faliks. Terry started playing piano at age 14. Really looking forward to hearing him play. And Grace has been playing piano since age 6. So we're going to hear both of them, and I'll be talking briefly with each of them. But first I want to bring up Professor Inna Faliks. Now, a number of you were here last January when she performed, and Professor Kaplan performed for us the previous January. Professor Faliks is head of the piano department. She's performed worldwide. She's a renowned pianist, so she's performed throughout the United States and Europe and Asia and on this piano. She's really talented. She's written a terrific memoir called Weight in the Fingertips about her journey from when she was young and living in Ukraine to becoming a world-class pianist. So first, Professor Inna Faliks.
Well, Stuart, thank you for this warm welcome. I really didn't do anything. I'm just looking forward to
Actually, I did want to ask you one question, though, which is, what are the role and importance of timeless music in difficult and heartbreaking times?
That's easy. It'll just take me an hour to get comfortable. No, just joking. I mean, of course, first of all, to all who have been impacted, and I think that's all of us, by these tragic events that began this year. We are all in this together, and the air we're breathing. I mean, I was thinking about this today, that the air we breathe, this terrible air, is not just ashes, it's people's memories, it's people's lives, and pain, and all of that we still think about nonstop, every day, all day. And it's us, and of course all of the students who are really going through this in their own way, because to them it's just all too raw and too fresh, and a memory of 2020 all over again. So, how do we address this, and why is music helpful? Well, I don't know why, but I think I don't have an easy answer, but I think it helps us have a clean slate. I think it helps us clear the clutter in our mind and start over and build something beautiful and fresh, and nothing helps the imagination or inspires it or feeds it quite as much as music. I don't think any other art form leaves as much to the imagination. So I think here words fail and music comes in.
And now I'm delighted to bring up and please welcome Grace Chen.
Thank you everyone for coming today. Is it working? You can hear me okay? Thank you all for coming again. So I just want to talk a little bit about the piece I'm playing today. I'm starting off with Johannes Brahms's transcription of Bach's very famous chaconne from his violin partita. And I chose this piece because I grew up listening to many violinists of the time, play this monumental work. And I really wanted to play it. I was so jealous of them for being able to express so much with just a solo voice. And so I seek to do the same thing with Brahms's most faithful interpretation of the piece. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. That was stunningly beautiful.
Thank you so
Really
much.
wonderful. So some questions for you. How did you come to love classical music? Does the story begin with your grandmother when you were 6 years old?
Yeah, definitely. I started piano very odd way. Like I was learning piano over Skype because my grandmother was all the way over in another country, and so there's a lot of limitations to what you can do over Skype. So I had a little too much freedom, and I started moving around. I did a lot of improv, whatever I wanted to do, and I just fell in love with music that way. And of course, in the following years with different teachers, the journey was much harder, full of tears and stuff, because I had to rebuild my foundation and all the classical teachings and things like that. But I still love music to this day, and it's going to be a lifelong companion of mine. So I hope to continue doing it forever.
And tell us about your grandmother. Was she a piano teacher?
Oh yes, she's a graduate and also a professor in Shanghai, and she still teaches piano right now. Yeah.
What does she think of how you're doing?
She's very happy, especially with she loves Chopin so much. So I hope she can listen to my Chopin someday when I go to China and visit her.
And tell us more about how you came to love Chopin and the other classical composers. I mean, many people your age are listening nonstop to Taylor Swift. You're doing classical music.
Yeah, I definitely have my musical tastes from my father. His grandmother really wanted him to be a pianist, but it skipped a generation. And so I learned a lot of the amazing composers like Brahms and Bach and Chopin and Schumann and Schubert. There's just too many to count. And I learned them all from him, and as well as my amazing teachers, including my Professor Inna Faliks, who's here today. I have so many pieces that I cherish and discovered through my years with her, especially things like my Brahms I just played for you today. Yeah, that's how I learned it.
And speaking of amazing teachers, Professor Inna Faliks, you've studied under her. Tell us about your time at UCLA and studying with Professor Faliks. How has that impacted your piano playing and your development as a pianist?
It's definitely a tremendous impact because after I had a lot of years where I was just felt like grueling on the piano, just because there's a lot of drills and things, a lot of rigidity in my teachings which were necessary. And through those many years, I started to forget about myself and why I wanted to do piano a little bit, because it became all about notes and correctness and all that. But then when I came to Professor Faliks' studio, I felt like I was rediscovering my spirit, because her spirit is just so amazing and so infectious. And I learned how to be a little more unapologetically myself, but also respecting the sacred text and music. And that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah, that raises a question that I have. How much is the job of the pianist to faithfully recreate the music that was composed by Chopin and Bach and Brahms and others? And how much freedom do you have to adapt it a little bit?
Well, it definitely depends on the piece, that's for certain. There's a lot of stylistic norms that are established for composers that varies between pieces as well. Bach has he's the grandfather, of music, so it can be daunting at times to tackle his music. But even through a lot of pieces that I played, I had a lot of misconceptions about Bach and how to play. I thought it was always just stoic and the very the samey. But then when I learned all the amazing Bach pieces, the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, and then the one I played today, under Inna Faliks, I was just amazed that there's so much things you can do with the piece that are you, but also very respectful to the text, because he designed it that way, all the creativity and imagination that you need to bring out using your own imagination. So it's kind of a back and forth always with the pieces.
You've been majoring in computer science as well as music. How has it been majoring in computer science?
It has been very interesting. It's always like a weird combination when I talk to people about it. But I think, it's not as big of a discrepancy as I thought. Like, there are some interesting patterns, like, that I didn't expect coming into UCLA as a student. Like, for instance, music is all about bringing to life, very sacred and historical masterpieces, and incorporating your own spirit into it. But, meanwhile, when people think of computer science, they think about, oh, it's always, the next big thing, AI, and, crazy robots and all that. That's always about the future. But in actuality, like, all these visions were stemmed from humanity's just rooted imagination. I'll just have to look at the old sci-fi movies, like The Matrix, Star Trek, and stuff. And it's like, it's all about bringing those imaginations to life and trying to learn and understand how to do that and do the impossible. And I think in relation to music, it's not that different. It's all about humanity, imagination, and achievement.
Interesting. So similarities between music and computer science.
Yeah,
Wow.
sure.
Is there anything you'd like to say about the first piece you played, the Bach-Brahms piece that was just with your left hand?
Oh, it was my very first left hand only piece, and I wanted to try it because I knew my left hand was kind of weak, so I wanted to see how far I could go with this piece, and it was incredibly fun because at the same time it's like really hard to figure out how to like teach it and how to approach it like from a teacher's perspective, but it's also so amazing that how much you can do. It's kind of like the same thing as violin, like how much you can achieve with just a solo violin, like in 15 minutes. It's like incredible. So that's kind of why I picked it.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Do you know what you'll be pursuing after you graduate UCLA?
I would be very incredibly honored to continue my master's here at UCLA under Professor Inna Faliks. That's my dream. Because I want to keep performing for people like you. And it's just amazing to be in the spotlight and to share my love of music to everyone, even in these difficult times. And also, computer science is also my lifelong friend. So even though maybe I can't do both professionally, I want to keep them my lifelong friends. And always, don't take them for granted. So that's my future plans here.
I have a feeling you're likely to achieve that dream. Grace, it's an absolute pleasure, a real delight to listen to you.
Thank you so much.
Grace Chen. And now it's a real pleasure to introduce another very talented student from the Herb Alpert School of Music, Sherry Hsu. Terry, you performed beautifully. Your fingers just dance magically across the keyboard. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you guys all for coming and listening.
So first, is there anything you'd like to tell us about the program you just performed?
The first piece I played, the Haydn, it is one of his last piano sonatas. You can really hear that he's trying to play a lot of humor in the piece with the little chirping sounds. And then throughout it, there's some interesting harmonic progressions. That's just, you don't get that often in classical music, or some of them are just not expected. And then the second piece, Brahms Opus 116, it's a set of 7 pieces, each with different characters, all very different. I chose this piece because last year there was a senior that also played it, and it reminds me of the time that I had at school, you know, spent in the practice room, or something as simple as just getting lunch with my friends. So playing through this piece just makes me think of all the great time I had here at UCLA.
I'll ask you about that in a moment. What about the question I asked Grace about, is your role playing piano to faithfully execute what the composer has written, or how much freedom do you have to kind of vary and adapt that?
I think Grace answered the question really wonderfully. It depends on any piece you play. Bach, really personal. I heard some people play a piece that's like half the tempo, and then I also heard someone play the same piece at twice the tempo. And each of those portray a different character, and it's not to say one's right, one's wrong, but it's a matter of what you believe and what you want to say when you're producing.
So tell us when your musical journey began. I think it was at 14. How did you come to love classical music?
Yeah, 14, I think it's a pretty late age for most people. Middle school, a while back. How did I come to love it? That's a great question. My parents never really supported me in classical music, actually. They were very conservative in the sense that, you know, men should, I don't know, go make some money.
Be an engineer?
Yeah, make some dirt, make some money.
Or a doctor?
Yeah, something like that, something along the lines of that. It never really clicked with me. I don't see how, you know, I can't do what I love and make money at the same time, although it might be much harder.
So what didn't click with you was the idea that you should just make a lot of money,
Yeah,
be an engineer,
or just give up
what you
my passion
love, give up what you love.
just for money and a stable life.
And why and how did you come to love classical piano?
I think at first it was the community that really brought me in. You know, every beginner we start with Bach, Mozart, all of those, and then I started talking about piano at school, and I realized, hey, everyone else plays the piano too. You know, we've all been through the same struggles of how the heck do we did that evenly, or how do we make that sound better. So at first it was overcoming each challenges that made playing piano more rewarding each time. But then after a little bit, it slowly became what I could do for the community rather than you know, me playing part of stuff. You know, I can.
Well, you've done a lot for our community this afternoon.
Thank you. Yeah, I can perform for a setting like this, which is wonderful.
You sure can.
Yeah.
So tell us about your time at UCLA. How's it been?
It's great. A lot of great people, great community, great professors, obviously. Everyone here is really supportive. You know, coming to a music school, especially in a field like music, you expect people to put you down constantly because there's a lot of competition. But I've honestly gotten the exact opposite of that. Everyone's really supportive. Everyone wants you to do good. Everyone wants you to play better. So yeah.
Well, you certainly do. So you've been a student of David Kaplan's. How has he affected your development as a pianist? You also have taken master classes with Professor Faliks.
Yeah. My favorite professor is Professor Kaplan, and I've had a few great lessons with Professor Faliks. But I I would say Professor Kaplan to me, is more than a teacher. He is a wonderful mentor, especially in the field of music. It takes more than pressing the keys down really fast and knowing exactly what to play to succeed in the music world. You need to know how to communicate, how to market yourself. And Professor Kaplan has been really great at going through all of these steps and knowing when to stop me and knowing when to tell me to push me to do something.
Do you know what your plans are after graduation?
I have applied to master's as well.
In music, right?
But Faliks just left. I was going to beg her to let me stay here again. But yeah.
I'm sure you'll do really well there as well. Anything else you'd like to tell us about piano and your music?
Just thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day today. It really means a lot to me and Grace.
So I'd like to bring, thank you very much, Chen. And I'd like to bring Grace back up. And now, I'd like to bring my colleague Michael up. And as a small token of our appreciation, Michael has gifts for each of you that are very richly deserved. Grace Chen and Sherry Chu, thank you so much. Thank all of you for joining us. That's our program today. Oh, you're okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, for a lot of people, that would be kind of stressful, standing up, especially,
Michael, it's wonderful to see you. How are you?